Welcome to Biology Made Easy. In today's lesson, we are discussing sexual reproduction in flowering plants. Specifically, we want to look at the pollen grain and pollen tube development, events before fertilization. The flower is the sexual reproduction organ. Well, I have a quick drawing of a half section of a flower. We have filament and anther. Together they form the stamen, right? And the stamens form the male reproductive organ. We have the stamens together called androecium, and that forms the male reproductive organ. Then we have the stigma, style, ovary, ovule. Together it's called pistil or carpel. And this forms the female reproductive organ. All the pistils and the carpels together form the gynoecium, which is the female reproductive organ. That's the flower. Now, sexual reproduction is the production of offspring by the fusion of male and female gametes, which is a haploid, to form a zygote, that's a diploid, which grows into a new individual. Now, the fusion of the male and female gametes is what is known as fertilization. Now, the male gamete is in the pollen grain, which is forming the anther. So this anther produces the male gamete, and the male gamete is in the pollen grain. We'll look at the pollen grain soon. Then we have the female gamete, which is in the ovule, and this ovule is in the ovary. In today's lesson, we want to discuss how the pollen grain and the pollen tube is formed before fertilization to occur between the male and the female gametes to produce the offspring. So now we want to find out how pollen grains are formed in the anther. Here is an anther. A cross section of this anther shows like this. And each anther has 4 pollen sacs. 1, 2, 3, 4. And each pollen sac contains a number of pollen mother cells. So these are pollen mother cells. A lot. Each pollen sac has a lot of pollen mother cells. And each pollen mother cell produces 4 pollen grains. So this pollen mother cell, 4 pollen grains, this 4 pollen grains. Each pollen mother cell is 2N, and it produces 4 pollen grains, which are haploid each. And when the anther is mature and dry, it splits open, that is, it dehisces, all right, and releases the pollen grains. Good. Now we want to discuss the detail of how the pollen mother cell produces the pollen grain. Each pollen mother cell produces 4 pollen grains. Now, here we have one pollen mother cell, is 2N, a diploid. It goes through first meiotic division to produce 2 cells. These 2 cells, each of them is haploid. Then it goes through the second meiotic stage and produces 4 haploid cells, tetrad. They are sticking together. That's why it's called a tetrad. And each of them is a haploid. Now, these haploid cells, each of them forms a thick covering around itself and becomes a pollen grain. So the pollen grain has a thick outer wall called exine, and these outer walls form a protective case around the nucleus. And because of the protective wall, the pollen grain can live for generations, protecting the nucleus inside. And each species have its own characteristic pollen grain shape and design. That is pollen grains. Now, each of the pollen grains, also the thick covering, have a pit or germ pore, they call it. So they have thick covering with pit. So we have just picked one pollen grain, that is its exine, thick wall, outer dead wall. Then you have a thin living membrane, and here is the nucleus. So just one pollen grain. Now, the pollen grain, remember, is haploid. And this haploid nucleus undergoes mitosis to form 2 nuclei. And the 2 nuclei, the cell divides and the cytoplasm divides unequally. So you have one large cell and a small cell. And the large cell, the nucleus in it, is called a pollen tube nucleus, and the large cell is called vegetative cell with its pollen tube nucleus. Then the smaller cell with its is called a generative cell with its nucleus, generative nucleus. So note that these are till N haploid cells because you started meiosis, made it haploid. Each of them is a haploid. It undergoes mitosis and divides into 2 nuclei, but each of them is still haploid. So this is the pollen grain, its structure and its contents. And this is how it lies down for generations. But as soon as pollination occurs, you have pollen grains released from the anther falls onto the stigma, and that is pollination. As soon as pollination occurs, this pollen grain lands on a stigma and absorbs water and sucrose from the stigma, and the pollen grain starts to grow. In time starts to grow through a germ pore, and as it grows, the pollen tube nucleus is the one that enables it to grow a pollen tube. So here is the pollen, a small tube form with the pollen tube nucleus at its tip, and the generative nucleus still there. That's the generative nucleus following. Then as it grows through the style, the generative nucleus undergoes mitosis to form 2 nuclei, and those 2 nuclei form 2 male gametes behind the pollen tube nucleus. The pollen tube nucleus sees to the formation of the tube as the pollen tube grows towards the ovule. So that is how come you have one pollen mother cell producing 2 haploid cells, first meiosis, second meiosis, 4 haploid cells develop into 4 pollen grains, thick walls. This pollen grain has 1 nucleus, then this haploid 1 nucleus undergoes mitosis to form 2 nuclei. One of it has a lot of cytoplasm, and that is the pollen tube nucleus. Then you have the generative nucleus. Pollination occurs and pollen tube starts growing because of the pollen tube nucleus, and you have the pollen tube nucleus and the generative nucleus behind it. As the pollen tube grows through the style, the generative nucleus undergoes mitosis to form 2 male nuclei. So that is how the pollen grain and the pollen tube develops. In our next lesson, we will discuss how the female gamete develops in the ovule. So, if this lesson has been useful, please give us your likes and also subscribe. Thank you very much. Goodbye.